Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today I'm going to focus on this image of the Western Veil Nebula, sometimes called the Witch's Broom. We're going to be focusing really on the processing in Photoshop. And this time I want to go through some of the maybe more advanced processes that I use and really should be part of anybody's repertoire if you're working in Photoshop or something similar. So to start with, you've probably seen some of my other videos where I show my processing in PixInsight, and that hasn't really changed, or at least not changed very much in the last year or so. If we look at what happens in Photoshop, though, I want to go over a couple things. First of all, this is the output from PixInsight. So I processed the data in PixInsight using kind of the usual tools. I used GrAxpert, I believe, Noise Exterminator, Blur Exterminator, Star Exterminator. And from that, I created these 5 files, the RGB stars by themselves, that were extracted from the RGB composite of the red, green, and blue filters, and then individual starless images for sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen. And you may notice a couple things. That first of all, they're not necessarily exactly the same density. Some are a little brighter or darker, and that's okay because we do all the final adjustments in Photoshop. But the other thing I want to talk about today, if you look at the hydrogen and sulfur especially, from the bright star, I've got some really nasty filter reflections, and I don't think I've noticed these before on this target. So this is something I haven't dealt with before on this target, but I want to show you how to deal with it in Photoshop non-destructively and without losing any of the actual structure or data that's in the images. So to start with, we need to load all of these files into Photoshop so that each file is a layer by itself. And to do that, we'll go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and it brings up this window, and we can browse for files that we want to add to the list. And these are going to be in my Western Veil folder. And here are those 5 files. So I just click OK. And I don't need to add any more files to the list, so I'll click OK. And now Photoshop will go out and get those 5 files and load each one into Photoshop as an individual layer. Hopefully you've seen some of my videos before, and I have changed the way I'm teaching color mapping in Photoshop. Not that it's better or worse, but I'm finding it's much easier to teach. It's easier for people to kind of relate to this technique. It's a technique that's been around a long time, and I had to finally prove to myself that it worked just as well as what I had been doing. The advantage is we treat all of the narrowband layers exactly the same. And so the first thing I want to do is organize my layers here, and I'm going to grab the stars and I'm going to put them on top, and I'm just going to leave the RGB layer hanging by itself at the bottom, and then I want my narrowband layers to be ordered by hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. Now if you've watched me before, you know that I go through a process of putting each one of these into a group. And let's just start that quickly. So I'll Control G, that would be Command G on a Mac, to put the stars into a layer group. Double click to change the name to stars, and then put the layer in screen blending mode. And then I almost always come down inside that group and add a levels and a hue saturation adjustment layer. So I'll just go ahead and add those now. And I'm just adding those from this adjustments panel. The layout I use is based on Photoshop's Essentials workspace, and you can come to this icon at the top right corner, and there are different kind of predefined workspaces. The one I'm using is based on Essentials. If you choose Essentials, then you can drag the panels around, change it to look exactly how you want it to look, and then if you create a new workspace, or you're just actually saving this workspace, and you can give it a name. So now that I have the stars in a layer group, I'll turn that layer off, and we'll go next to the hydrogen. And here's where it's going to be different. I'm going to start out the same. I'm going to put this into a layer group. I'm going to add, within the layer group, I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer. And now I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer. And this is the big difference. This is how I now color map every layer. And because this is hydrogen, let's be neat and name this. The settings for hydrogen are going to be almost the same for all of them. We're going to choose colorize in the hue saturation layer. I'm going to take the lightness down to -50, and that's somewhat important. At -50, it's the same as doing a layer channel map. I'm going to take the saturation up to 100%. Since this is hydrogen, the default would be to map it as green, and the hue for green would be 120. So you can either use the slider or you can just type 120. And so we've now color mapped this layer to green. The last thing I'm going to do is put this layer in screen blending mode, and then I'll turn it off. And I'm going to do the same thing to the next layer group, and then the same thing to the next layer group. And the only difference between them is going to be what color do I put into the hue saturation. Now, rather than going through this time and time again, Photoshop has the ability to record actions. And you would get to that either through the Actions palette if you have it in your toolbar over here, or you can go to Window and Actions and open up that Actions palette. And some actions sometimes are called macros. It basically is recording a series of mouse clicks and keystrokes and steps and commands so that you can record them and then play them back on a similar file or in a similar circumstance. And so one of the things that you might want to record is putting this layer, for instance, into a layer group, changing it to screen blending mode, and adding some layers that you think you'll probably use. And in fact, I did do that. I saved that as Make Astro Layers. And you'll notice, if you can see it on the screen, this even has a shortcut key of Control F11. So I can select the layer where I want to execute it, select the action I want to execute, and then click the play button. And it did that for me automatically. It did not name it because it doesn't know what group I did this on. So I would still have to name this oxygen. And I would need to come into the color, and since this is oxygen, I'll color it blue, which is 240 on the hue rotation. And then I would do the same thing. Let's turn off the oxygen, and I'm going to turn off this bottom layer. I'll do the same thing with sulfur, and this time I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut of Control F11. And there's my hydrogen layer, or my sulfur layer. Now, you can take this even a step further and record a macro that does an entire stars HSO set and includes the naming and setting the colors. And in fact, I've done that. You record a macro by starting on creating a new macro with the plus icon down here. The tooltip says create a new action. And then you go through your series of steps, and when you're done, you click the stop button. So I'm going to just close this and start completely from scratch. We don't want to save it? No. So I'm going to go back to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And just like we did before, I'm going to choose these 5 files, click OK, OK again. That was on the other screen. I apologize, you couldn't see that. But it's doing the same thing we did the first time around. It's loading these files as layers in Photoshop. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my stars and drag it up to the top. And I've got oxygen, hydrogen, sulfur. And the way I recorded the macro was with the stars layer currently selected. This uses a keyboard shortcut of Control F10. So I press Control F10, and there's my image in SHO with the stars on a separate layer. The RGB is just kind of hanging around here at the bottom. I could have RGB, I could have other layers that I'm not using. It only puts the first 4 layers into groups, and it assumes that they're in the order of hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. So there's my SHO image, already color mapped with those color values that I suggested are the default starting point. And for color mapping, I really do 2 things now. I would go through each one of these, and generally I'll have to adjust the black slider in the levels adjustment. And you do that generally by watching the background where there's nothing going on, and you try to get it somewhat neutral. And usually that means that the blacks slider on the histogram adjustments is going to be pulled over to about where the data starts. And depending on how I happen to have stretched it in PixInsight, that could be further to the right or further to the left. Within reasonable ranges, it doesn't really matter where it's at. If I want to fine-tune the color balance, it's real easy now. Generally, if the SHO default doesn't look good to you, if it looks like it has too much green, then we can go to the hydrogen, and we'll start here and take some of the green out by moving the hue slider back to the left. And then generally we'll need to go down to the oxygen slider and also slide it to the left. And that gives us a much more pleasing overall color balance to start with. We can fine-tune it if we want to. That's even shifted more towards orange. And with those shifts, we may need to revisit the levels adjustment. And if you need to, there's nothing wrong with using the midpoint slider. You want to be careful with the whites slider, because you can see the data goes all the way over to pure white. And if I pull this whites slider into the left, that will be brightening the whites and in fact kind of blowing out those highlights in this color. So there's a fairly decent color balance. It could certainly be better, but it's good enough to start with at this point. What I really want to focus on now are these reflections, and we need to get rid of those. And to do that, I'm going to turn off the hydrogen. I'll just close that layer group. Oxygen doesn't really have them. If I turn the hue saturation off, this is the oxygen layer by itself. It's pretty clean. A little bit of a bright spot here where the star was. Maybe a little hint of some of the reflections up here, but it's much cleaner than the other two. So let's start on sulfur. And to do this, I'm going to turn off, again, the hue saturation so that we can see it. And I want to also turn off this levels adjustment. So now we're looking at just the file as it came in from Photoshop. And in my macro, I also added a blank layer. And the important thing about this blank layer is it's in soft light blending mode. Now this is a technique that's been around in Photoshop for probably decades. In the soft light blending mode, anything on this layer that is darker than medium gray is going to darken what appears below it. Anything that's lighter than medium gray will lighten what's below it. and anything that is exactly medium gray or blank has no effect. So I can simply brush or paint on this layer. This is called burning and dodging, and it's commonly done whether it's a portrait or a landscape or any kind of an image. Ansel Adams was a master at burning and dodging in the darkroom, so it's a technique that's been around for decades in the darkroom and then implemented in Photoshop. People do it a number of different ways. This is the way I do it because it feels the most flexible. All I need to do is paint on this blank layer with either a black brush or a white brush. And to do that, I'll come over to the toolbar and select my brush tool, and I want to make sure that I have my hardness set at 0, so it's an extremely soft brush. And then there's a couple of keyboard shortcuts that are very handy. The first one is the B key on the keyboard selects the brush tool. The D key, D as in dog, will select the default foreground and background colors, which is black is the foreground, white is the background. X will swap the foreground and background colors. So if you're getting ahead of me, you can anticipate that I can paint on this with black, and just by tapping the X key, I can switch to lightening with white, or tap X again, go back to darkening with black. The last thing you need to control is the opacity of the brush. I usually start with about a 10% opacity, and the last keyboard shortcut for the brush is using the number keys. If I tap, for instance, the 3 key, the opacity will change to 30%. The 1 key is 10%. 0 is 100%. If I want something less than 10, I can tap 0.5, and that'll give me 5%. So I'm going to start at 10%, and if you look at where these reflections are, there is still a lot of detail. So the reflection didn't hide any detail, it just made that detail a little lighter. So what we need to do is just carefully darken anywhere these reflections are. Painting on a separate layer, so this is completely non-destructive, and I'll just start, every time I click and paint, it's adding 10%. I can use the left and right bracket keys, I guess I lied about the last keyboard shortcut, to make the brush bigger and smaller. And usually I will start with a large brush and then gradually go to a smaller and smaller brush as I get more refined. If I go too far, just tap the X key to paint with white and lighten it back up. So it becomes a bit of a dance going back and forth between brightening and darkening, making the brush bigger and smaller. Oftentimes it's useful to zoom out and look at the big picture, and it may look a little bit different to you. I can see there's some areas that are too dark. And generally you want to paint with, I'll say, with the largest brush you can without bleeding over into areas that you don't want to darken. And it's kind of okay to get too dark, but you don't want to leave it too light. If you accidentally paint with white, you just switch back to black. What we're trying to do is smooth this out. Now, some of these up here in the blank sky area, we really could have done this with more of a brute force approach, like a clone stamp, or personally, I hardly ever use the clone stamp. Instead, I would use the remove tool. But where we have these reflections in the middle of detail, this is just a wonderful way to remove those reflections. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be good enough that your eye no longer perceives a pattern. And that happens a lot of times where you're trying to clean up something that has left some sort of a pattern, and our eyes see it because of the pattern. So if you can break up the pattern so that it's no longer recognizable to our brains and our eyes, then that accomplishes the goal, even if it's not done perfectly. And that, I think, is especially true where you have other patterns going on. Is this going to restore it to exactly what it would have been had we not had the reflections? Probably not, but it's far better than just about any other approach. So at this point, I'm just about done with the sulfur. And usually when you back up and look at it, you'll see some that you missed. This is non-destructive, and I'm not going to flatten these layers, so I could, after I save this file, I could come back later today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and add to or refine or take away. Since I'm just painting on a blank layer, if I decide I've completely messed it up and I want to just start that area over again, I can grab my erase tool and just come over here and erase. Remember, I'm still working on this blank layer, so I've just erased all of my corrections there. Now I can go back to the brush tool and clean it up a little bit. So let's say that's good enough. I'm also going to darken some of this glare that happened around the bright star so that that doesn't kind of jump out at us when we process it. The oxygen I said was okay, so I'll just turn these layers back on, turn off the sulfur. Oxygen's probably okay. Let's just touch it up ever so slightly. We'll just a few areas where you can kind of imagine, and of course we have a lot of glow around that bright star. This is also a great way to minimize the halos that appear around bright stars. If you have corners that aren't even, you can darken them down. Just all sorts of ways to use this burning and dodging. And the last one will be sulfur. Again, I'm going to turn off the hue saturation and the levels adjustment. Go to the blank layer that's in soft light blending mode, and this one is particularly bad. I'll try to work through it as quickly as I can, but I want you to see the process, and even though it sounds like something that's going to be horribly tedious, you'll find with practice, you just look around, focus on darkening light areas and lightening dark areas, and if you make a mistake, like I am here, you just tap the X key and paint black over white or white over black to undo what you did. Use the left and right bracket keys to make the brush larger or smaller so you can get more focused or less focused. And at 10% opacity, each time I click the mouse, it's putting down 10% opacity. So if I click multiple times, it builds up density. If I just click once and drag the mouse, it's only going to put down that 10% opacity at the most, and then the next one will go 10% beyond that. If you really get into this kind of retouching, if you're doing high-end portrait work, for instance, you would do a lot of retouching like this to smooth skin, adjust or lighten wrinkles, bags under eyes, blemishes. Actually, in high-end portrait retouching, most of the retouching is actually done with burning and dodging, using a very fine brush, sometimes as small as like a 1 or 2 pixel brush. And it's amazing how much you can do just by lightening and darkening something. It's also a fun technique for landscapes if you want to even out the light or even enhance shadows to show more texture. Texture is just seen because of contrast, and contrast is just the difference between dark and light. So if you want to enhance contrast, you can simply darken the shadows a little bit and brighten the highlights a little bit, and lo and behold, you have created more local contrast. And if you have rocks and you want to make the texture in the rocks stand out more, or shadows from trees or whatever, just by very carefully burning and dodging, you can adjust the perception of sharpness, the perception of texture, make texture more obvious or less obvious in the case of retouching a face. And as I said, Ansel Adams was a true master at doing this kind of work in the darkroom. You might think that would be impossible, but it's actually very possible. It just takes a lot of skill and a lot of patience. He and others have really mastered that technique. So I'm just about done here. A couple big reflections down here at the bottom. And I know this isn't very exciting to watch, and when I look back I can see I went way too far here, so we just lighten this back up so it blends in. And like I said, the main thing is to break up patterns. Now if you want to see what you've done, this is on a separate layer, so I can just turn this layer off and on. And sometimes when you do that, you'll see that, for instance here, it's too dark. So I'm going to lighten this up and blend it back in a little bit. If you find 10% is too aggressive, and sometimes you'll find that after you start working in finer and finer detail, you may need to reduce the brush opacity to 0.5 or even 0.2 or 0.3. So let's turn all the layers back on. Now we have our SHO image without those reflections. These are all in screen blending mode, which means they're brightening whatever's below. And I purposely left the RGB at the bottom because I'm going to turn it back on and kind of use it as a kind of a foundation for the image. So I do want to make some adjustments, so I'm going to again use Control-G to drop that into a group, label it RGB, and this I'll just leave in pass-through blending mode. But I will add a levels adjustment to darken it down a little bit, but I'm going to let some of that natural color and some of the glow around the central star come through. Typically the last thing I do is global adjustments. So I'll come, if I collapse all the layer groups, and I still have the stars turned off, between hydrogen and the stars I will almost always add 4 layers. I'll add levels, color balance, hue saturation, and then I'll add a solid color fill layer. And I want it to be RGB values of 19, 19, 19, which I can get to by just typing 13, 13, 13 into the hexadecimal field. And then I'll put this in lighten blending mode. And what that does is anything that is darker than that is going to be brightened to 13, 13, 13. And I've got kind of a dark area here that looks like, I don't know if that's on the hydrogen, like it's on the hydrogen. Looks like I went too dark there, so I'm just going to come back to the hydrogen layer, and I'm just painting with white on this burn and dodge solid color fill layer. If I want to change the overall color, which I think I do, I can use the color balance layer to shift it even more towards the red. I can use the hue saturation and shift the hue of the entire image more toward red. And when I do that, I may decide I want to change the color of the oxygen. So I'll go back to the hue saturation layer for the oxygen and just play with its hue. And I may also want to play with the overall brightness to bring out a little bit more of the detail in the oxygen. And this kind of brings us to the stars now. When I turn the stars on, there's just a lot of stars. And I generally like to greatly reduce or minimize the stars, and I'm going to do that in a couple steps. The simple form is if you just use a simple levels adjustment. If you darken the stars, in effect you're making them smaller because they are a point spread function that's brightest in the center and then gradually get darker. So if I just darken the stars, they get smaller. They do start to get a little odd looking though if you do that too much. So the first thing I'm going to do is come to the layer itself, and I'm going to convert this into a smart object. Smart objects are a very nice non-destructive tool because I can apply filters to a smart object, and they're non-destructive and changeable. So to turn this into a smart object, I'll right-click on the layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now I can apply a filter, and any filters I apply will in fact be considered smart filters. And the first one I'm going to use is under the noise grouping of filters, dust and scratches. And again, this is a filter that's been around since the film scanning days. And by changing, I have a threshold of 0, and by changing this radius, I can tell it kind of what size dust spots and scratches I want to remove. Generally with my system, I find around 7 or 8 is about the largest I can go before it starts to really look odd. So I'm going to stop at 7 here and click OK. Now, you'll notice now below our smart object is smart filters, and it shows dust and scratches, and there's even a mask so that I could mask this effect from individual regions of this layer if I wanted to. I can also turn all smart filters off and on, or I can turn just the dust and scratches off and on to see the effect. I can also add another smart filter. So in this case, I'm going to add under Sharpen, I'm going to add a Smart Sharpen. Now, don't be confused. The term Smart Sharpen doesn't have anything to do with it being a smart filter. It's just they came up with this Smart Sharpen algorithm, and then a year or two later they came up with the idea of smart objects. So they just happen to both be called smart. On my system, generally I want the stars somewhere in around the 3 pixel range and somewhere around 400% amount. Click OK, and that'll restore some of the sharpness that the dust and scratches filter removed. And now I'll finish up by darkening the stars. And if I decide that, gosh, it looks good everywhere, but I don't really want to darken the diffraction spikes and this big bright star, you might say, well, that star actually looked better the way it was before. In fact, we can even see a little bit of a dark ring around it. I can just come to this layer mask on the levels adjustment layer in the stars group with black as my foreground color on the brush. I'll make the brush bigger, and I'll go to 100% opacity and just click here, and I just am hiding the effect of this levels adjustment on that star. And if I want to go further and even hide the effect along the diffraction spikes, I can make my brush very small. And you can draw a straight line with almost any of the brush tools by clicking once at the start of the line, go to the end of the line and hold the Shift key and click again, and it will draw a line connecting those 2 points. So if I just do all 4 of the diffraction spikes. So now we've restored that diffraction spike. And of course we can revisit any layer here at any time. If I decide I want to adjust the color more, I can revisit the color balance. If I decide I want the red from sulfur to be even stronger, I can come down here to the sulfur group, because that's where the red is coming from, and go to the levels adjustment, and if I move the mid slider to the left, that's brightening the sulfur, which is red, And if the background starts showing too much red, then I just grab the black slider, move it back in to neutralize that and get us back to a more neutral background. So there's a couple more advanced techniques that you could use in Photoshop. Again, I would save this now as a .psb or large document format file, and it will save it with all of these layers and adjustment layers and settings intact. It does make a big file, but I could come back tomorrow and continue editing this same data without having to redo or undo anything. If I see something I missed with the burning and dodging, I can come back and adjust it. Those are just some very powerful tools. I guess the last thing I'll mention, and I'll leave it for you to explore, just like we converted the stars layer into a smart object so that we could add sharpening, you can do the same thing with each one of these layers, the hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, as well as the RGB. Each one of these can be converted into a smart object and then apply smart sharpen, for instance, as a smart filter, and sharpen those layers individually appropriately for whatever's on that layer. So I think I'll wrap it up here. If you have any questions, be sure to drop those in the comments below. And hope you found this useful. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.